An Israeli Air Force base at the heart of attacks on civilians in Gaza has repeatedly received deliveries of spare parts from Britain since October the 7th, despite the UK government downplaying the importance of its arms exports to Tel Aviv.
We sell relatively little arms to Israel.
That's the finding of an investigation by Declassified UK and Irish news outlet The Ditch. Joining me now are journalists from both those outlets, my colleague John McEvoy and The Ditch's Roman Shortall. Great to have you with us, guys.
Cheers for having us, Phil.
Thanks for having me.
Let's start, John, with your investigation, published in partnership with The Ditch, that I think really exposes the supply chain between Britain and Israel and sheds new light on how the F-35, Israel's most advanced fighter jet, depends on spare parts being shipped from Britain to Israel.
So what we found is that RAF Marham, which is a British Royal Air Force base in Norfolk, has been directly shipping components for Israel's F-35s. And what we revealed is the entire production line. The registered sender is the Lockheed Martin headquarters in the UK in a little town called Havant. Now, Lockheed Martin, as many listeners will probably know, is the lead player in the international consortium that produces the F-35s. They're being kind of held at RAF Marham. RAF Marham being the key site, the kind of headquarters for Britain's F-35 program. They're being sent on via Heathrow Airport to Tel Aviv and then onwards to Nevatim airbase in the Negev desert, which is where Israel stations its squadrons of F-35. So what we've really managed to uncover here is the kind of entire production line, including British civilian airports, including a British military base, RAF Marham, in providing F-35 with the key components that it needs for these fighter jets to stay in the air. And the importance of this story kind of increases quite dramatically now that we know that F-35s have been directly engaged in war crimes in Gaza. I mean, we long suspected it, of course. It's been described as the most lethal fighter jet in the world. And we've known since November that the F-35s have been kind of communicating with Israeli ground forces in Gaza and therefore, directly complicit in the raids that are happening there. But it was only a couple of months ago when a Danish media organisation revealed for the first time that the F-35 was used specifically and directly used in the bombing of the Al-Mawasi camp, which was registered by Israel as a safe zone. At least 90 people killed, hundreds more were injured, seriously injured. We've got what seems to be very clearly, British complicity in Israeli war crimes. The UK government is not just approving the parts, it's helping them to be sent to Israel, and those fighter jets are being used in some of the most horrendous crimes.
John, you've managed to pin down these 7 shipments that took place all since October 7th, up until as recently as August. And we know with these F-35s, it's like a Formula One car. They need constant servicing after each mission. And with the intensity that they're being used, not just over Gaza, but also in Lebanon, they also did this vast bombing raid out to Yemen as well, twice this year. They'll be getting through a huge amount of spare parts. And so these shipments that you've seen coming from the UK to Israel are to enable these aircraft to keep flying in this conflict, which is being investigated as a genocide. Now, as you mentioned, you've been doing this work in conjunction with The Ditch, and we're very pleased to be joined today by one of The Ditch's journalists. Roman, can you tell us how you came across this story? Because I know your focus has primarily been Irish complicity in Israel's war on Gaza.
We had been looking into, I suppose, the use of whether or not Irish airspace was being used to transport munitions to Israel. And what we had discovered was that planes coming back from Israel were transiting through Irish airspace. Now, I mean, that was certainly like a worthy story, but it wasn't as big as the stuff that we later discovered, but it certainly got us interested in it, and that's how we requested these documents. So when we got these documents, there was quite a bit of work and I'll get on to the law in a second and why like that it's a problem that Irish airspace is used. But we basically tracked, we got airway bills, which are kind of like commercial invoices used by airlines carrying cargo. And we got tracking numbers, and we got details of what exactly was being carried and who it was being carried for and who it was being delivered to in Israel. And what we discovered then, after doing, our verification, which involved tracking all of these items and also verifying with the Israeli tax authority that these goods or munitions had arrived in Israel. What we discovered was that there were 6 flights during that period that passed through Irish sovereign airspace. And the reason that that's a problem is that this airline, Challenge Airlines, did not have permission to transit Irish airspace. Because in Ireland, the system that we have in place is similar but slightly different to the UK system. In the UK, you can apply for a general permit, an open permit, as an airline to transport munitions through UK airspace. Whereas in Ireland, you need individual permission for each flight. And it's generally been the government's policy, and they also promised in our parliament that this wasn't happening, but it's been a policy that they would not grant permission to companies that wanted to transport munitions to Israel over Irish airspace. So that's kind of how it started. It then turned out that there were a lot of other airlines doing it. Israel's national carrier was doing it, and still has been up until a week ago, as we reported recently. Lufthansa was involved. They've been using Irish airspace for like 3 years to transport munitions to Israel. So it turned out that there was effectively no enforcement of the legislation that we have in Ireland for the carriage of munitions of war, and legislation actually that provides for up to 3 years imprisonment for an airline carrier that carries munitions without permission from the Minister for Transport, which these airlines did.
Let me just bring John back in at this point. So can you talk us through sort of what happened next in terms of the flights that Roman had seen going over our Irish airspace?
The Ditch, as Roman mentioned, kind of picks up on this trail of flights that were carrying munitions to Israel via Liège airport, and he mentioned those documents that were obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. And I saw the Ditch's article, and my kind of first thought was, well, if they've gone through Irish sovereign airspace, then got on their way to Liège, then presumably they've passed through British sovereign airspace as well. So yeah, I mean, I did kind of parallel story to what the Ditch had already done at that point. Tracked all of the flights mentioned. Found that something like over 50 tons of munitions for Israel had passed through British sovereign airspace, and as Roman was mentioning, typically flights that are carrying munitions through any country's airspace will require a certificate, a certificate to say, that they're permitted to travel through. Whether these certificates were, approved or given by the UK government remains unclear. We're gonna try and basically find out more information on that front, because there are a few possibilities of what's actually happening here. Either, every, cargo airline that wants to fly munitions to Israel gives an individual certificate, gets that approved by the UK government, which is, of course, a problem because that's another layer of complicity in a genocide, right? Alternatively, they're doing this illegally, which is, as Roman said, seems to be the case in Ireland, that no certificate is requested or provided, and they're just flying through UK airspace without completing the relevant forms. Or third, there may be some kind of pre-existing defence agreement between the UK and Israel whereby the certificates aren't in fact needed, where there's kind of a blanket approval for any cargo flight that wants to pass through British airspace with munitions for Israel, which I think would probably be the most concerning of the three, and perhaps also the most likely scenario of the three as well, of course.
And John, you've been doing loads of these really important investigations this year, shedding light on lots of different aspects of UK complicity in the genocide in Gaza. But often, they just don't get picked up by the mainstream media here. And as people who follow this channel will know, Declassified UK was started about 5 years ago, kind of as a challenge to the mainstream media here to show lots of the things that they don't report, particularly when it comes to UK arms exports and its alliance with repressive regimes around the world. Roman, the Ditch, from what I can tell, you're a similar kind of small media outlet. I don't know lots about your history, but could you tell us what it's like doing this kind of work in Ireland? And are you able to break through more easily?
Yeah, so like we're only 3.5 years old. We started around March, April 2021. It was very difficult to kind of break through. And I think like for the first year, we had some pretty good stories, but very, very difficult to kind of get into, to get some of them into mainstream coverage. I find in general, like it's the standard of story that we have to produce to get into mainstream media is very, very high. I mean, much higher than the standard of story that would be good enough for the front pages of these newspapers. I think there can be a kind of there's a suspicion towards independent investigative journalist outlets, and when you're not in that kind of where our equivalent to Westminster is called Leinster House, or we'd say the Leinster House bubble. When you're not in that bubble, you're not in the club. So automatically there's an air of suspicion around what you're doing, and you're seen as a bit radical or unorthodox or whatever. I think I'd like to think that we're a bit more adversarial than most other outlets, and I think a lot of people, and some of them have even said it, that they don't like that. So yeah, even what we're doing now, it's very difficult to get the flight story into media, and in a lot of cases, when it does get into mainstream media, it's on government terms. It's when government's saying, "Oh, we need to establish the fact." The focus is on when government has something to say about it.
Roman, John, thanks very much for talking to me this morning about the excellent stories you've been doing. If you're watching this video and you haven't already subscribed to this channel, please click the button below and also subscribe to The Ditch on Twitter and their social media accounts, and help us all do more adversarial journalism that breaks down the Westminster and Leinster House bubbles. Thanks for watching.